So, so having both heard some of the talks and gotten a better sense of the audience, I apologize. First of all, it's a real pleasure to be here. I'm having a tremendous time. It's intellectually extraordinarily satisfying to get an interaction with a group of scientists whom I normally know of and rarely see and enjoy every time that I get the opportunity to interact with. And this is this issue of understanding aspects of speech and language. It's clearly one of the the great behaviors that challenges all of us, and there are many excellent questions. So it's something in my field that we're always, at least some of us, are always looking towards. And what I want to do today is, it's impossible to give you a sense, a real deep sense of what birdsong learning is about. But it itself is very, very deep, and I think much deeper than most people who aren't in the field really appreciate. So you've all heard that birds learn their songs, and it has some sort of similarity to speech acquisition or something like that. Right? That's what you hear. You hear at the beginning of a talk a couple of brief statement about that. It goes much deeper than that. Okay? And so what I want to do today in this first lecture, almost entirely it'll be about behavior. And I'm going to make an unabashed, sort of very rapid fire, go through a lot of material that tries to point out the, not just the similarities, but the interactions between the two fields. That is, how work in one field has informed work in the other. And the reality is there are many examples where discoveries in birdsong learning have informed insight into the organization of speech and language in humans. And there are good examples where the same thing has happened, where all this incredible, I mean, really, in some sense, the one animal we know more about than any other are humans. Because, you know, humans have no pride. You can get someone to sit there with all this amazing stuff on them, microphones stuck into their mouths and sensors all over them and so on. And then, of course, you can get them to report their sensations, their feelings, their thoughts at that moment. We know a tremendous amount about humans. There's a lot of examples where insights into human behavior have driven work in birdsong. This goes both ways. I want to give you a sense of that. So what I'm not going to do is point out where there are dissimilarities, and we can talk about that as well at some point, but that's the goal for this morning. And I think it'll be helpful. Okay? So these are very loosely some of the topics I'm going to talk about today. I think we need to start by asking what is a songbird? And I was going to put up a picture of a bird. Here's, you know, the head, here's the tail. Start with basics, but I figured we don't need to do that. So we now know, and it's only been quite recently, that we know quite a bit, have quite a bit of confidence about the relationship of songbirds to other birds, and this is through modern molecular techniques. And what we knew, this is work of Sharon Hackett, actually, at the Field Museum in Chicago. What we knew as of this work was that, in fact, songbirds, which is this large group, they're called passeriforms, are the sisters group is psittaformes, or parrots and allied birds. So parrots also learn vocalizations, right? Polly want a cracker, that's a learned vocalization. And it actually raises the question, at what point in this evolution did, in this taxonomy, did learning arise? There's a group of so-called, these are the Aucenes, or birds that, true songbirds, unless you're an expert, those are the only songbirds you know about. And there's a big group of sub-Aucenes, or neotropical songbirds, that are said to not learn their vocalizations. It's not true, but we just don't know that much about it. Clearly some of the birds here learn as well. And so it's a little unclear where the learning first evolved in this. But I wanted to raise one point right away that I think is relevant to talk about. What if the taxonomy looked like this? Okay? There were a bunch of birds over here and over here that didn't learn vocalizations. There were some extinct species over here, and then there was one species of bird. To honor this conference, we'll talk about the European starling, and it learned its vocalizations. Would we then be discussing the question, did song learning evolve? Okay. I'm not going to try to answer that question, but you will see similarities between this taxonomy and one that we've been discussing in this conference, and I just want you to think about that. Okay. Another thing that I really feel I need to say before I dive into my topic in depth is it's really important, in my opinion, as a neurobiologist, when I put on my neurobiologist hat, it's really important to recognize the difference between this massive state-of-the-art supercomputer versus, the 8086s, most of you, you're too young to even know what that is, that represent the brains over here. And that analogy is an extraordinarily poor one. So I don't mean to push it very much, but the computational power of this beast should not be ignored. And in all our discussions, we talk about qualitative differences, not quantitative differences. Part of the reason we have such a fantastic memory is we have a fantastic computer to support that memory, and we access it very quickly. And that allows us to do things that may ultimately appear to be qualitatively different, but they're quantitatively different. At least that's an idea, and I think that we should be thinking about that. Okay, now, it is important to say something about brains at the onset of a discussion about the relationship between speech language and birdsong learning, which is that if you look at an avian brain, it seems superficially more similar to these brains over here than all these brains over here. And the reason is that all these brains are covered by, not cortex, it's wrong to use that term, it's neocortex. It's a particular type of cortex that's associated with mammalian brain, 6-layered cortex. All mammalian brains have neocortex. And of course, human brain is extraordinary in its expansion of the neocortex. Whereas superficially, birds don't seem to have one, and I'll get back to that in one instant. And it's given rise to a couple of ideas that are flat out wrong. I mean, they're just flat out wrong. And the first one is that birds are stupid. Right? We have the term in English, in any case, bird brain, right? And it's not an endearing term in any case. Some of you, maybe many of you in the audience, know vastly more about this than I can talk about here, and perhaps some of you don't. So I just picked out one. Oh, it's running already. I'm sorry, I didn't realize that. Let me go back because I want to say something before I start. So this is actually initially an anecdotal observation in the laboratory, which then turned into a series of scientific experiments. It's been known for a long time that these particular crows, these Caledonian crows, make tools in their natural habitat, and it's extraordinary if you look at the literature, what they do. But here in the lab, there was an experiment being done. These are pair-bond birds, and so there was the mate of this female being told to do a certain experiment where the animal was supposed to take various wires and that had different shapes and to try to retrieve a food source. And the lady here got really bored with the behavior. Come on, guy, you can do better than that. And so she did this following thing, and it was extraordinary. So she's going to now take one of these wires and try to retrieve the food source, which is in the bucket and the piece of rope there that is how she's supposed to do it. And she's not succeeding. She tries a little bit, she tries a little bit. It's not working. Okay, okay. Then what does she do? She pulls out, watch, jams it in a little crevice here, the wire, comes around like that, makes a nice hook. Right, if you've never seen this before, it's really extraordinary, and gets the food source, okay? Now, there's a vast literature now on the, yeah, it's extraordinary. It's really extraordinary. The first time you see it, you shout out. It's so amazing. There's a vast literature on the cognitive abilities, especially of crows and ravens, which, by the way, are songbirds. And we don't have the time to talk about it, but roughly speaking, they seem to have many of the cognitive abilities that non-human primates do. They're certainly very, very smart animals. Okay. So this idea that birds are stupid doesn't obtain. The other idea is that birds don't have a cortex. Okay. And that's because the early anatomists didn't see a neocortex, and they made a supposition that the part of the brain called the basal ganglia, which well, it appears that all vertebrates have. There is a vertebrate body plan, and it actually extends into the brain. They had the idea, since they didn't see structure up here, that all this was hypertrophied striatum. And when I was starting out, the names were all neostriatum, ectostriatum, hyperstriatum, and it's flat out wrong. And we now know this. And I won't go much into the detail, but it's so wrong that something happened that virtually never happens in science. Everybody got together and agreed and changed the names. So we no longer use that ancient terminology. A critical piece of information that you should be thinking about is this very elegant work by Jen Dugasford and colleagues, including Cliff Ragsdale out of University of Chicago, where they used neocortical layer-specific molecular markers. So a marker that lights up cells in layer 4, or lights up cells in layer 5, or lights up cells in layer 2, 3 in the neocortex, and applied it to the forebrain of birds and reptiles, and found the following, that, and this is particularly true, they did most of their studies looking at birds, that there's a standard circuit in the neocortex, basic circuit where the dorsal thalamus projects to the input layer of neocortex, layer 4, which projects to cells in layer 2, 3, in a local circuit that project to layer 5, that project out of the brain. And they found the same circuit in birds. It wasn't organized in a layered fashion, but both the molecular constituents of those cells and their circuit properties are shared between birds and mammals. So birds do have a cortex, without a doubt, and it has the same functional and molecular organization, but it's not organized in layers. Okay, so you should know those facts. So now let's move on and talk a little bit about birdsong learning. So you need to get some sense of the extent of it. So, you hear this? Oh, well, let's go back because we missed. Did you hear that? Okay, that's there are roughly 3,500 species of songbirds. Most of the field works on the bird that has the worst song in the world, which is the zebrafinch, but it's very useful to work for in the lab. This is my thesis bird, white sparrow. This is indigo bunting. Here's canary. You all know canary. And it can go on for a long time, and I want you to listen to this. That's a short snippet of a song of a European starling. And the question in many of your minds right now is, am I listening to one bird or more? That's a single bird singing. And it can go on and on. If you don't feel I have the time, but we could go to YouTube and search for David Attenborough, or just Attenborough, and lyrebird. And if you've never seen that clip, it will astound you. Okay, so there's an enormous variety of different songs, and birds have a lot of complexity in their songs, and that complexity in vocal production has to be, and is, we know it experimentally, associated with complexity in vocal perception. So experimentally it's very advantageous, but also think about it. Think about if there were half a dozen species of hominids that all spoke, and they had different speaking behaviors, different speech and language, or maybe they had the same, it would give us enormous insight that we don't have at the moment. So not knowing what the evolutionary history in terms of the recorded history of what language or speech early hominids produced, if any. And not knowing any other extant species really impoverishes our conversation. Here, we have tremendous, we can gain tremendous depth by bringing it into the laboratory or going out in the field and combining those sets of observations. Okay. And there is enormous complexity. It's not just about a simple tape machine that copies song. It's much more complex than that. Okay. Now, one thing that was typically used actually to characterize songbirds is the number of muscles in the syrinx. Syrinx is a complex vocal organ. I'll have more to say about it in a moment. For doing behavioral analysis, looking at sound spectrographs, frequency versus time representations, has been extremely valuable and has really helped propel birdsong, understanding of birdsong forward enormously. But that's not how birds sing. Right? Birds sing by moving the musculature, and we've ignored this in the field for a long time until quite recently. That's really where the description has to come. Just similarly, spectrographs in speech can be useful, but really understanding the articulatory motions is really where our analysis has to be. And over the past 10, 15 years, there's been really a seismic change in our understanding of this, and this has really been propelled by the work of Gabriel Mindlin, who's a wonderful man and a brilliant man, and has led a team of scientists that has developed a compelling mathematical description, starting with the basic physics of the movement of the membranes of the syrinx, and then ultimately, eventually evolving to a more complex and fuller model that includes not only the syringeal mechanics, but also the upper respiratory filters that change that vocalizations. And so those of you who know anything about speech production, it'll immediately strike a bell. Here we have a source filter model. And it turns out that the normal form equations of the dynamical system that he developed, that he ultimately discovered the relationship between that and these well-established normal form mathematics are very, very similar to the ones that describe speech production in humans. So I'll have much more to say about this in the second lecture because it gives us tremendous insight into brain organization. But here's just one example where we put a little relay, a solenoid on top of zebra finches. This is a 13-gram animal, so this is a pretty small device here. But we're able to very, very rapidly shunt the air sac system, which pushes air through the syrinx that's necessary for producing sound. And here you see an example where we've turned this solenoid on briefly. And not only you can compare this sound here, this is the spectrograph, this is the oscillograph of the sound, and this is the air sac pressure. You can compare this sound to this sound, and you see that there's a droop in frequency here. And so frequency production interacts with the pressure of the system. Okay, and here's a second example. Compare these two E syllables to these up here, for instance, and you see that they're drooping in frequency. And this behavior is predicted nicely by the model, and it's well known in mammalian vocalizations as well. So even these peripheral mechanisms are really quite similar. Okay, so I want to spend a few minutes now running through, but at least touching upon the traditional story of birdsong learning. You go out, Peter Marler, he's been introduced already, in his early days. He was a clever guy. He left soggy England, came to beautiful San Francisco area, set up camp at Berkeley, and then started running around the countryside recording white-crowned sparrows. And there are these geographical, all the birds in a given geographical locale all sing the same, have the same structure. The song conforms to a structure. This is in Marin County, this is on the Berkeley campus, and this is Sunset Beach. Wonderful places to have to do your field work. This arises through learning, okay? And the term dialect is chosen knowingly, and in fact we now have 30, 40, 50 years of recordings of seeing how these dialects change. There's an interesting story there. If you now bring the birds into the laboratory at very young, you can control their song exposure. And you can do an experiment where you expose the bird to the songs of other species that are in the same breeding territory, so-called sympatric species, and you can show that there's an innate predisposition of the bird. If he's going to choose any song, he's going to choose the song, he's going to include the song of his conspecific song of the same species, but might also incorporate some elements from other species. But there's a strong tendency to already have knowledge about which song the bird should incorporate in his own song as he grows up. And I'll have more to say about that in a moment. Now, these early song exposure experiments sort of overemphasize things by taking the birds out of their natural habitat and sticking them inside of sound boxes. It turns out that social factors are extremely important. So Luis Baptista did a beautiful experiment years later where he took white-crowned sparrow babies and he arranged them in an arena so they could just see one cage in front of them filled with an adult bird, and had a wall behind them filled with adult white-crowned sparrows singing their heads off in early spring. But the one bird in front of them wasn't a white-crowned sparrow, it was a song sparrow, and the birds tended to learn elements out of the song sparrow's song. So it's not just listening to the song, but it's the social interaction that's extremely important that helps drive this process. And I don't think I need to make for you all the connections with how we think about the development of speech and language, but I hope that you're thinking about that as I go along. So you can now do the experiment that you can't really do. The literature in humans are always horrible and aberrant cases. You can take birds and raise them in complete sound isolation. And these are the songs of 6 birds who are physically intact, but during a critical period early in development, they were deprived of exposure to the own species song. That tends to extend out the critical period to some degree, but not so far. If these birds, as adults or even late in juvenile development, are exposed to normal song, they will not acquire normal song. So these are very abnormal songs, and a song I failed to mention in many species, including these, is sexually dimorphic. Females choose males in part based on the quality of their songs, and no self-respecting white-crowned female would ever choose a bird singing a song like this. Okay. The other thing, and this is the critical insight that Mark Konishi accomplished in his graduate studies, if you now take very young white crowns and you surgically prevent them from hearing, surgically deafen them in the original experiments, the birds sing extraordinarily abnormal songs. I mean, you need to be an expert to even guess that these are white-crowned sparrows singing. So these are now 6 birds, the songs of 6 white-crowned sparrows that were deafened early in development. And this shows you the variation in songs of 2 birds. So not only they can't acquire any structure to their songs, any normal structure, but every time they try to sing, there's variation. Okay, they can't even hit the same target. And we understand this, and again, you can relate this to people that are congenitally deaf and try to learn speech. They learn language, as we all understand, but they can't acquire normal speech production. Okay? And this can contrast with, as has been shown in a different example, in this case, chickens were deafened, and it had no effect either on the apparent structure of the vocalizations or their functional utility. So a deaf rooster can still stand there and make a sound that will attract hens to a food source that bird is from.
If those birds have been deafened, that means that also they're lacking auditory feedback?
Yes.
And
yes.
That plays a role in what you're observing?
So it's critically the loss of auditory feedback that is causing this abnormal behavior. So there are 2 stages to song learning. First, the acquisition of the memory, the auditory memory of the adult song that the young bird commits to and then tries to copy via sensory motor feedback. And that, in fact, is a brief statement of the so-called template theory of birdsong learning, the idea that a sensory memory of song is acquired early in development, and the bird then uses auditory feedback to access that sensory memory to modify his own vocalizations during development, and then ultimately produces the adult song. And that itself is a very, very complex process, and again is very, very similar to what we experience as humans. So let's dig through that a little bit. Okay? So a number of different species have been examined in this regard over an extended period of time, and here's work by Peter Marler and Susan Peters done on swamp sparrows, excuse me. And just a couple of critical points. It's not a linear process. It's not that the young juvenile sits there and first of all, he doesn't burst out into adult song. He hears the adult bird singing, a couple of minutes later, he's singing his beautiful adult song. It doesn't work like that at all. Okay? And he doesn't go through a simple sort of iterative process, which is a clear, path from here to here. It's the path from being a juvenile bird to singing an adult song is an extremely complicated and challenging one. So these are birds that commit months of their lives, and they don't live that long, months of their lives to this complex process, and it's hard for them. It's clearly challenging for them to do this. And again, think about the analogy. Speaking is not easy, right? It's a big cognitive load. Learning to speak takes a brilliant organism, a young child, years to learn to speak properly, right? It is a challenging process, but and so there's that similarity. In the case of these birds, these swamp sparrows, you can control all the different songs they're exposed to early in life, and what you see is at the height of the birds first go through a phase of singing which has been likened quite compellingly, as you'll see in a few moments, to babbling in infants. We call it subsong. And then they start singing song with more structure, which we call plastic song. And it's similar to sort of variegated babbling, and then the emergence of speech from that. At the height of plastic song, these swamp sparrows are incorporating many components from many different songs into their singing pattern. And then suddenly, when they crystallize their song to create that one song, the average is 1 or 1.1 song types per adult bird. So some birds sing 2 song types, most sing 1 song type. And European starlings, have 80 different motifs on average in their adult songs. It depends on the species. There's just prior to the song crystallization, rapid crystallization of song, there are 4 times as many different syllable types in the case of swamp sparrows, 4 times as many syllable types in their singing pattern as will survive into the adult song. And the ones that tend to survive are the ones that the bird was exposed to early in development, and so that's how song copying or song imitation continues. But some of those syllable types are variations on the pattern that the bird was exposed to. So the bird was exposed to a syllable type A, and he's singing an A prime song, and in the A prime syllable, excuse me, and the A prime syllable is a perfectly normal syllable. Swamp sparrow syllable. And he's never been exposed to a swamp sparrow syllable type C, but it's a perfectly normal syllable type, and that's what the bird is singing. Okay, so he actually can invent completely new syllable types, which are normal species-specific syllable types during the developmental process. Okay? So can you use this for anything useful? So you can do an experiment, many experiments that you can't do in humans, but you're very interested to find out about. Okay, so here's an example where isolate birds, isolate zebra finches in this case, males, were ultimately paired with females, and this process was then several cycles of this process, the F1 and the F2, the process was continued, and then you look at the songs of these birds, and after a few generations, a normal zebrafinch song type emerges. So if you're interested in questions about, creoles and question about these forms of language development, here's an experiment that I thought when I first saw it was extraordinary and really gives you experimental control and insight that would be hard, that help inform the conversation with regard to on the human side. Okay, now there are other aspects of song production that it's important to appreciate. Once these birds produce their adult songs, we used to think that many species no longer are sensitive to auditory feedback, and that's completely wrong. So even a zebrafinch, which is a so-called closed-ended learner, its sensitivity to the songs, the model that it's going to acquire, that sensitivity exists only early in development, and it no longer changes its song as an adult. Even a zebrafinch is extremely sensitive to auditory feedback. And once you go away from the dogma and think about it, you realize it has to be the case. Zebrafinch males make their livings by singing enormously precise songs. They really are a champion species for that. The control they have over the dynamics of singing. And the only way you achieve that control and maintain it throughout life is great sensitivity to auditory feedback. Just as I, right now, am listening to my own feedback, and because of the echoes, it's a bit confusing to me. And if you don't know this, just cup your hand over your ear while you're speaking and you'll hear the difference right away. We are very sensitive to feedback, and adult humans who suffer a profound hearing loss, arguably the strongest deficit that they suffer is the loss of being able to produce functional speech. That doesn't happen to all humans, but it happens to many. They can no longer, it's one thing to hear what you want to tell them, it's another thing if they can't tell you. And it's a big, big deficit. And it's because of the loss of feedback. So here's an example where through an old system, delayed auditory feedback was presented to zebrafinches, and eventually you can get them to sing very, very abnormal singing patterns. Here's a more modern version of it. We actually attach an accelerometer to the bird's head, and that picks up the substrate vibrations as I'm speaking now. They're vibrations that I feel here. The vibrations go into my head, and you could record my speech from that, and you can record the song of the bird through a similar system, and that allows you to record the singing behavior without having a microphone picking up the airborne sounds. So now you can present delayed auditory feedback continuously, and you can crank up the gain and not get that wonderful effect that rock bands like, which is that squealing of the feedback, not so good for a science experiment. You can get these effects to occur not over weeks or months, but within days. So you could argue about whether it occurred on the 4th day or the 5th day, but without a doubt, on the 6th day, you get a bird that's singing A, B, C, D, 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 D. He's stuttering for all intents and purposes. Again, we can argue about whether this is real stuttering or not, but certainly the similarity is interesting. Okay? And no zebrafinch would ever sing that, ever, ever. Okay? And it's very interesting that you can remove now the delayed auditory feedback, and they continue to stutter for a long period of time. Yes, sir?
And that's in humans, if you give delayed auditory feedback, you can induce stuttering. So
right.
And also it's used to treat stuttering in some cases.
Exactly, right. So there's and it's amazing to me that the NIH isn't interested in this as an animal model system yet for stuttering, given that we don't have an animal model system for it. But yes, the similarities there are, let's defer it a little bit because there's so much to say. It's not the same as human stuttering, but it's interesting enough. And how is this by accident that this group of animals show a similar behavior under these similar peculiar conditions of delayed auditory feedback? Of course, it's not an accident. Okay? So Ofer Turnerkowski started an amazing set of experiments in his lab, which continue to this day, very powerful behavioral observations. You'll see several of them, by developing better ways of analyzing the corpus of vocalizations that an animal produces over the million or so songs that the bird will sing during song development, and along with Parthomitra and others, developing better code for creating a sound spectrograph, and brilliantly, in spite of the suggestions of his mentor, just simply releasing the code to the community. And it's created this enormous wave of modern experiments in the field. It was a tremendous thing that he did. And as well, Ofer developed a way of bringing song development under much stronger experimental control than we had before. So an isolate bird is raised, a bird is raised as an isolate till about 35 to 40 days of age. And one issue is that that bird is likely already singing and producing some isolate singing. But then at that point, he's introduced first time through instrumental conditioning, he can access a normal song. So in Ofer's case, because they're a very, very artistic family, there's a beautiful zebrafinch model with an embedded speaker. The bird pecks at these keys that he has access to for the first time at that time in life. He pecks at a key, he hears a song, an adult zebrafinch song, and in many cases, you can tell it's a very, very dramatic experience for the bird. And he may go like this, and actually many of them fall asleep right away there. And if they hear roughly 10 such songs, just 10 songs, which is 15 seconds of song exposure in the morning, and say another 15 seconds, another 10 songs in the afternoon, and you do that every day, you can control the singing behavior. You can control what song the bird is going to sing. So you can bring it under tight temporal control. And this, plus all the development of the new analysis techniques, showed that different types of processes of learning, so the structure of how a bird might achieve different targets can vary. Different birds have different types of developmental trajectories that they will follow. So some birds will actually, early in development, just repeat one sound time and time again, and then vary that. So this would be, what's the term, not variegated, but the canonical babbling, you know, da 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 da, like that. And other birds will early in development produce a complex structure and then vary and keep that fixed while they vary that template, as it were. And then using either of those two pathways, you can get the same results ultimately. So starting down here, either following a serial repetition pattern or a motif-centered pattern, the birds can ultimately make good copies of the songs that they were exposed to. And this captures a lot of the complexity of what we think is occurring as we study speech and language development, right? So again, the birds are showing similarities here. What an amazing coincidence, or not, okay? But it goes further than that, much further than that. So ultimately, Ofer asked the question, can we learn something about when birds choose to make these transitions? When birds, if you give a bird a challenge to change during development from, say, doing an AA transition, bigram transitions from AA to AB, how does the bird do that? Okay? And the answer is, if you look at when in development that occurs, what you can see is that birds will choose to make the transitions from AA to AB, or from AB to BA, or something like that. They'll pick specific points and times, and you can track that. You can find a given transition occurred at this point in development, and another transition occurred later at this point in development. Okay. And then they ask the amazing question, is that true of how kids acquire these transitions as well? So the child's database had been out there for, I don't know, 20 years or something, and nobody had ever observed before because they didn't know to ask the right question until this birdsong story came along, and they looked in the human database, and they find very, very compelling evidence that the same pattern, developmental pattern, that they first saw in birds now exists in that database that had been sitting there for a long time. So it's a particularly compelling example of a piece of birdsong research really informing the human literature. Okay. So I'm going to now move on to another topic. So years ago, we had discovered this crazy observation before we knew anything about the behavior, that if you record from certain neurons in in this case in an adult bird, while the bird was awake during the day and singing, and then looked at the same neuron while the bird was sleeping, and the neuron was spontaneously discharging, you saw at a high level of statistical significance, you saw structure of bursting in the sleeping brain that was similar to the same pattern of bursting that those neurons expressed during singing. So this is an example of neuronal replay. And of course, we can't do that with single neurons in humans, but we talk about reactivation of areas in the brain or rehearsal, and we believe that neuronal replay exists in lots of different animals. In any case, when you look for it, you find it. So this motivated ideas about maybe vocal learning in songbirds. There's a sleep-related component, and there, the human literature, which was going through sort of a modern phase of reinvention, if you will, was very helpful to us. And a number of years later, Ofer came out again with a very elegant observation that, much to everybody's surprise, and much to my relief, because it's very strange for a neuroethologist to first publish a physiological observation and say there must be this behavior. That's not the way neuroethology normally works. Okay, so I was very pleased where they showed compellingly that birds on a daily basis go through a variation in their singing patterns so that the songs early in the day have less structure, so lower entropy variance, this particular measure, and that after singing in the morning, the songs develop higher structure. The birds then go to sleep, and the next morning, their singing pattern, again, is not as well structured, and then it develops during the day. So this is, through many experiments I don't have time to go over, this is explicitly not a circadian phenomenon, it's a sleep-dependent phenomenon. Okay? What? Let me answer that question. Okay, very briefly. You can prevent the bird from singing early in the morning, and then if he sings later in the day, he'll still start the songs later in the day that are unstructured. Or you can give the bird melatonin and get him to sleep during the day, and then when he wakes up, he goes through this pattern, even though it's in an abnormal time. The one thing I've refused to do my whole time, and Ofer has never done either, as it turns out, is sleep deprivation experiments, because I don't know how to interpret them. All I know is that when I don't get a good night's sleep, I feel terrible, and I know that's true for a bird too, and so I don't know how to interpret the fact that the behavior is weird after that. So I don't like those experiments, but there are many good experiments one can do. The most compelling reason for that, though, is that the depth of this variation is predictive of how good a copy of song the bird makes. So it's a very adaptive phenomenon. Okay? And in fact, again, if you look carefully, you can see that this occurs not on the day the bird is exposed. Remember, the bird pecks the key for the first time that day, hears the 20 songs, and this is a very dramatic event for the bird, and his singing behavior doesn't change at all that day. The next day is when it first happens, after a night's sleep. And we did quite a bit of work to look at that. And in fact, in the brain, those bursting patterns I told you about, the protobursting actually in the adult bird, if we record at night when the bird is sleeping, we don't see that protobursting prior to song exposure. The bird is exposed to song on that day, and then that night we see the protobursting, and then the next day this singing pattern will emerge. And now there's an emerging human literature on the relevance of sleep for speech acquisition, for speech and language acquisition. Okay, so the observations in one system went in the other direction.
Can I ask one question about
Yes, please.
the opposite one? So in human speech, every so often we make a speech error by replacing sounds in their positions and so on. Is there anything known about speech errors or song errors in birdsong?
In adults or in?
Well, I mean, if it's a system where you combine elements and make longer sequences out of combination of existing elements, then every so often it might go wrong. I mean, that's what happens in human speech, right? So we make speech error. One in 1,000 productions, humans make a speech error.
So,
and I would expect that you should also might be able also to see that in songs of songbirds, where a syllable has been replaced from its position.
so certainly during development, there's a lot of variation. I don't know if one can call that error because it's in the learning phase. But even in adult birds, although there's a clear, it depends again on species. There are species where there's variation through every song. No two songs are, at least superficially, appear to be similar. But even if you take a species like a zebrafinch, where there's a very clear canonical pattern, you do see errors. Or at least you see, we can't call them errors. They absolutely are variations, and they occur at typically occur at relatively low levels. So, and it turns out that the electrophysiology of those transitions turned out to be particularly, give particular insight. Okay, so this idea that sleep is important for sensorimotor vocal learning then invaded the speech world. And here's a task where you come into Howard Nussbaum's lab. This is a task that Kim Fenn developed. And you hear a synthesizer that's been adjusted to make it relatively difficult to understand the very simple words, simple CVC words, cat, dog, roof, whatever. And you hear it, and you're supposed to type out what you hear. Okay? And so first you're trained a little bit on that, and then immediately after your training, you're tested. So you hear new words, and you're tested, and you're supposed to type them out. Then you come in the evening, and you do it again. You come in the next morning, you come in the next evening. There are many different tests that we did on these subjects. And what you find out is that you get a significant improvement immediately after post-testing. Your performance that evening goes down very significantly, and it's recovered the following morning after a night's sleep. Maybe not a good night's sleep, because these are all U of C undergraduates, but nevertheless, after a night's sleep, your performance is recovered, and then it's stable thereafter. Okay? And this phenomenon occurs, so it's a sleep-dependent phenomenon, and it's important to appreciate the individuals never heard the same word twice. So this is generalized learning, and you actually don't see the effect for rote learning, but you see it for generalized learning. So this is sleep-induced learning of new categories. So this then encouraged us to look further into this process, and what we found it turned out that sleep in birds had been examined quite a bit, but it had been a long time since anyone had really put a bit of muscle into it. There was some very extensive work done maybe 20 years previously. And when we looked at it, we were surprised to see that for the most part, songbirds had been ignored in the 30 or so species that had been looked at. When we looked at zebrafinch sleeping, we saw a mammalian-like pattern. So here's a bird sleeping. You can see him breathing, okay? You can actually hear the EEG in the background, and here's the EEG being recorded at the same time. And it's not perfectly synchronized, I apologize, but at some point you start seeing twitches of, oh, there's one, there's another one. There's another one, and a head movement, another one, another one, another one, another one, another one. There, 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 there. So if you look in the literature, what you find, the literature says that birds have no REM sleep, or very, very little REM sleep. And the typical episode is 4 plus or minus 2 seconds. And you just saw 15 seconds of zebrafinch REM sleep. Okay, and in fact, when they start to sleep early in the night, they have lots of slow wave sleep, which goes down. Early in the night, they have very little REM sleep, which goes up. And the duration of REM bouts goes up as well. Okay. Now, those of you that know about human sleep know that this is the pattern that humans show. Okay, and it's actually not a standard mammalian pattern like it's oftentimes said. The mammalian system that's examined most extensively in this regard is rodents. Rodents don't have consolidated sleep patterns, and they don't show these patterns. In fact, we know very little, well, I won't go there because it's complicated, but here's a pattern that we see which is quite similar, again, between birds and humans in this case. And we see this not only in zebra finches, we see it now in starlings, and apparently we see it in budgies, in parrots. So either this is true for most or all vocal learning birds, or maybe it's more true for birds in general than has been appreciated up till now. That's an open question. But it gets to the issue of the evolution of these patterns. Okay? So I'm going to try to run through the remaining few things because I'd like to touch upon this again. You can bring a starling, a European starling. No, there are no American starlings. There are European starlings. They came over about 150 years ago, 160 years ago. About 50 of them were released into Central Park by the gentleman who thought he should recreate all of Shakespeare's birds in New York's Central Park. And now we have about 300 million starlings in North America. And I discovered that there's a classification of birds by the US Department of Agriculture which is lower than vermin. And that is alien vermin. And that's what these guys are. But they're brilliant animals. I mean, they're very clever, and they sing beautiful songs, and they work very well in the laboratory for a food reward. And here a bird is hearing a sound and is, depending on the task, we can do a go-no-go task, a two-alternative choice task, two-alternative forced choice. We can do whatever we want with these animals, and they work very well. So you can bring a starling into the laboratory, and you can give him an exposure to a simple song paradigm, a perceptual paradigm. He's supposed to distinguish between different classes of songs. And in this case, in this most simple example, there's no change in the performance comparing his performance immediately after training and in the evening. But then after following a night's sleep, you see improvement in the behavior. Okay, so it's a sleep-dependent phenomenon again. You can now do the experiment where the bird is exposed to one song in the morning and has exposed to a different set of, not one set of songs, excuse me, in the morning, a different set of songs in the afternoon, so it's an interference experiment. And when you do that, then if you look at the performance on the set of tasks and songs in the morning, you look at the performance in the evening after the bird was exposed to a set of A songs in the morning and then B songs in the afternoon. Then you test him on A songs in the evening, and now his performance has gone through the floor. Okay? He's doing a terrible job on those A songs, but following a night's sleep, his performance recovers. So there are retroactive effects, interference effects, and there are proactive effects too. Having been exposed to A songs in the morning and then B songs in the afternoon, the performance on B songs in the evening is terrible and then recovers after a night's sleep. Okay? And this is very, very similar to what's known in the human literature. In fact, we actually see behavioral evidence for sleep reconsolidation in these animals. And this is an animal model system that mimics the observations seen in the memory consolidation literature in humans more compellingly than any other one. Just another accident. Okay, whoops, excuse me. Okay, so there's much more to say there, but I'm going to stop there because I want to stir up the pot a little bit more even. So what about more complex perceptual phenomenon? So we've already in the conference touched upon some of this. There was a study that came out a number of years ago that claimed that Cottontop tamarin monkeys could not perform rather complicated perceptual task that was related to a structure that is thought to be important for syntax in the Chomsky definition of the hierarchy of different types of grammars. Okay, so this was the distinction between the finite state grammar and the context-free grammar, the first and second levels of the Chomsky hierarchy. And Chomsky years ago had said, with absolutely no knowledge of the animal literature as best as I know, and certainly no data to support it, that animals only do finite state grammars, humans do context-free grammars, and that's what makes humans special, right? That's the generative or beginning of the generative aspect of a language, which is utterly remarkable and special, to be sure, but we want to understand what the basis of it is. Okay, they didn't find this in the. It was basically, in my opinion, a negative result that got published in Science, but it did set out a framework for doing this experiment, which was really very well thought out. So I was sitting there at my desk. This is again an example of of the interaction between the two. My brilliant postdoc and now associate professor at UCSD, Tim Gentner, was doing sort of victory laps for other work he had done, waiting for the right job to come along. And Howard Nussbaum walks into my lab and he says, "Have you seen this?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "This is," he said some word. I said, yeah, I agree. What's the big deal? And then he said, "You could do this in Starlings." Okay, I hadn't thought of it. I was sitting there and thinking about it. Yeah, we could. So we get Tim in, we talk about it, and we did this experiment, okay? And I don't know that, especially because time is running on, I don't know that it's important to go through all the details, but I'll try to very briefly give you a sense of it. So we split up the motifs that the starlings sing into two categories that we didn't know explicitly that they distinguished as two categories, but had good reason to, which are called warbles and rattles. I can tell you more about the details if you want. Okay? And then we created different strings of warbles and rattles, so it might be warble, rattle, or warble, warble, rattle, rattle, so A-A-B-B, A-B-A-B, and we assigned them to different keys, and it's a counterbalance design and the whole thing, and we asked the birds to learn the distinction. And of course, they could learn that distinction very well. They could distinguish strings that were organized as context-free in the context-free grammar framework versus those that were organized in the finite state grammar framework. That's boring, they just memorized it. What's the big deal? Okay, but they can do it, okay? But then you do the experiment where you now take the birds and transfer them to completely new strings of the motifs that they're familiar with. They have to know the motifs themselves, but the strings are new. Okay, so you give them new context-free grammar strings, new finite state grammar strings, and ask, is there any savings in learning? And it turns out there's an enormous savings in learning. So it appears that they've not only learned the motifs and those particular strings, but they've learned something about the rules that underlie those strings. And then you can do a variety of different observations, tests on what rules they've learned. And again, for lack of time, and I don't know, this is old ground that's been hashed and rehashed many times. I don't know that we need to do it again. But in any case, we concluded that it appears that the starlings have learned something about the underlying structure of the context-free grammars. And so for a number of years, I went around giving lectures saying that this ability to be sensitive to these higher order structures in sequences of utterances is unique to humans and European starlings. And somehow that was not always met with great satisfaction. It tended to be met in sort of, there was a bimodal distribution of how people responded to that, okay? And subsequently there's been work done on a number of different songbird species that actually extends this as well. And it is very controversial, to be sure, you should understand that. But again, it's a connection between the two systems that we would have never thought to do such a crazy experiment in songbirds. I mean, why would you ever do that unless you had a reason to, and the reason came from the human literature. And we found what is, in any case, a useful result. So at this point, I want to stop. This gives you, I hope, some sense of, let me do something. Let me get to the end of things here. There's a lot more I could talk about, but I'm not going to. This is not what I'm suggesting, okay? This is not the right way to think about it. It isn't, okay? But this is the right way to think about it. Okay, and I apologize for having preempted our conversation on Friday. This is Charles Darwin, and this is how you have to think about it. And if you think about it this way, and you start looking for the connections, and you see an enormous amount, what I just told you was, it could just be all happenstance, okay? Or we see constantly that studying one system gives us enormous insight into the other, and it goes in both directions. And if this isn't compelling to you, wait for the lecture that will follow, where I can't yet make the connections to speech, but I can show you observations that are very compelling and almost, in my mind, almost certainly are relevant to how we produce and ultimately perceive speech and language. So that's a teaser that goes beyond what I can do. Don't misunderstand. I don't mean to suggest that, but from my perspective, the connections between the two, the depth of the connections, and in fact, the relationships, what I believe are homologous, deep homologous relationships between mammals and birds, not parallel convergent evolution. I think this relates to deep homology because they share a common forebrain structure. Cortex, it's neocortex in mammals, it's a different type of cortical organization in birds, but the underlying functional connections and cell types and circuits are quite similar. And so, you know, we're very thankful in the birdsong world. We go on, you guys give us great ideas, occasionally we give you great ideas, and it works for us. And so I'll stop there now. I'm happy to answer any additional questions, and we can take a break and continue in a while. Thanks.